Welcome, everybody. Welcome to today's episode of the Law of Self-Defense. I am, of course, attorney Andrew Branca for the Law of Self-Defense. So imagine this. You're in your car, sitting at the drive-thru window of a local burger joint, waiting for your order. And as you glance inside, you suddenly observe an apparent robbery taking place. You are, of course, armed with your trusty CCW pistol. Can you lawfully present your pistol and fire a few rounds through that drive-thru window at the robber? If you do fire those rounds, can you lawfully flee the scene afterwards, never calling police, even if you've managed to hit the robber with some of your rounds? That's what we'll be discussing in today's Law of Self-Defense show. By the way, if you stay with us to the end of the show, we'll explain to you how you can get your very own copy of our best-selling book, The Law of Self-Defense Principles, your handbook to being hard to convict if you're ever compelled to use force in defense of yourself, your family, your property. Stay with us to the end. We'll explain how to get a free copy of that best-selling book. So, the event we're discussing today actually occurred in Santa Ana, California back in 2018. So 6 years ago, but it just came across my desk today, and I thought it worth covering for our Law of Self-Defense community, particularly since we have some rather dramatic video footage of the event. So this involves an armed robbery of a local burger joint, the Cozy Corner Drive-In. By the way, the Cozy Corner Drive-In still exists, according to Google. Apparently, it's still in operation. Fair warning, though, if you check out the reviews, they appear to be a wild swing between tons of 5-star reviews, people love the joint, and tons of 1-star reviews. People hate the joint. So if you like taking your chances, maybe try out the Cozy Corner if you're ever in that neck of the woods, and feel free to share your experience with all of us. That would be a funny follow-up. Before we jump into that, I do want to remind all of you that today's Law of Self-Defense show is sponsored by our good friends and longtime partners, CCW Safe. CCW Safe is a provider of legal service memberships, what many people mistakenly call self-defense insurance. In effect, CCW Safe promises to pay their members' legal expenses of the members involved in a use of force event, and they do much more than that as well. There are a number of companies out there that purport to offer similar services. Some of them are worth considering, different flavors, best suit different people, but some of the offers out there are hot garbage. I could never recommend under any circumstances. CCW Safe is my personal choice. I'm a member of CCW Safe. My wife, Emily, is a member because we trust them to do what they say they'll do should the worst happen. If you'd like to learn why I trust them, you can point your browser to lawofselfdefense.com/trust. I have a brief video there explaining exactly why CCW Safe is the best fit for me and perhaps the best fit for you as well. Also, at that same URL, lawofselfdefense.com/trust, you can find a 10% discount code for when you become a member of CCW Safe as well. Again, that's lawofselfdefense.com/trust. So what we'll see when we look at the surveillance video of this event, we'll see a cashier in an orange shirt behind a counter, and she is just minding her own business, waiting for business, it would appear. And that's when things go to kick off. So here she is in her orange shirt, and the robber is going to enter through that door in the back, wearing a puffy black jacket, wearing a mask, and his hand shoved into the pocket of his jacket, as if he were in possession of a pistol. Maybe he is in possession of a pistol, who knows? The bottom right-hand corner of this image is where the drive-through window is. So, with all that said, and by the way, does it matter if the robber actually has a gun or is just pretending to have a gun in his pocket, if he's just pointing his finger inside his pocket to make it appear, to make the cashier believe that he has a deadly weapon he's pointing at her to facilitate the robbery? Does it matter for either the crime of armed robbery or for any legal justifications for defending yourself against that maybe gun? The answer is no. It doesn't make any difference. If he's creating in the minds of his victim the reasonable belief that he's pointing a deadly weapon at them, then he's committing the crime of armed robbery, whether he actually has a gun or not. And in terms of the legal justification for the use of force, if the person using defensive force reasonably believes that they're threatened with a gun, it doesn't matter if there's actually a gun or not, so long as the perception of the gun is a reasonable perception. So let's run through this roughly 30-second video of the official surveillance video taken from the establishment provided by the local police department to the public. And keep your eyes open for a red circle that will appear right about where the woman is standing right now. She's going to move over to the register in response to the robbery demand. But behind where she's standing now, some dramatic stuff is going to happen. Let's roll that videotape. I'll make myself a little smaller so we can see that better. Here we go. Just minding her business, not much going on, and here comes the robber. He tosses a red plastic bag at her, has got his hand in his pocket, he's giving his orders, presumably. She goes to the register, pops it open, starts filling the bag with cash, and then suddenly, what happens? Kablam! Kablam! That poor cup of water fairly exploded. That was the round coming in through that drive-through window at the robber. I like that so much. Let's go ahead and watch that little clip of the cup exploding. Let's watch it in slow motion. This is at 1/4 speed. Here we go. Kablooey. Kablooey. Now this is, I believe I actually have a little graphic I created of the path of the bullets. So this is what we're watching happen right here on the screen. The bottom right-hand corner is where the drive-through window is. There's the cashier and the robber and the cup, the poor cup of water that sacrificed itself to that round. Actually, a number of rounds were fired through the window, and at least a couple of them, we know for sure, struck the robber. How do we know that? Because the robber made it as far as across the street from the establishment, where he collapsed and was found by police and EMS, and he'd been shot twice. So that turned out to be pretty dramatic indeed. Now, witnesses were vague about the number of rounds fired, but the robber was shot twice for sure, and there were other bullet impacts in the establishment. We'll see a couple of evidence photos of those. By the way, of course, this robber received free medical care, surgery, and medical care, and of course, nothing requiring someone else's labor or resources is actually free. So you're welcome, criminal class. And he's expected to make a full recovery. And I mention that because it's worth noting. Presumably, he was shot with a pistol twice. Pistols are really pretty poor at decisively ending a threat, right? This guy managed to run all the way across the street. If he had a gun, if we assume he actually had a gun, and he wanted to use it inside that establishment, he had the energy and ability to do that. He just chose to run. And he ran across the street before he was apparently compelled or psychologically induced to give up and just stop there. So fair warning, if your primary defensive tool is your pistol, don't expect magic from your pistol. They're really pretty poor at decisively ending a threat. Also, I should mention, I expect this robber will make a full recovery. Most people who are shot with handguns do, if they receive prompt medical care, as he apparently did. And I expect he'll then, when he makes his full recovery, he'll promptly return to a life of crime. It's worth keeping in mind that if you're ever facing a real bad guy and you're pointing your pistol at him, he may not be all that intimidated by your pistol. After all, a lot of bad guys have had guns pointed at them before. A lot of bad guys have been shot before, like this guy now has been shot twice, and they recover and they're still out and about committing crimes. Now, there is also evidence, as I mentioned, of other bullet impacts in the establishment. There's this one. A bullet went through the plate glass window at the front of the store. There's another one here, a couple of bullet holes marked on an interior wall or barrier inside the establishment. So we know for sure a number of rounds were fired, 2 of which struck the robber for sure. So where does that leave us? Now, of course, first the question is, could it have been lawful for the people in the car outside the drive-through window? Could it have been lawful for them to start lobbing rounds into this burger joint through the drive-through window? After all, the people in the car aren't under any threat from the robber. Well, sure, it can be justified. There's at least 2 possible legal justifications. One would be the use of deadly force to stop a deadly force threat against others, defense of others. Generally speaking, you're permitted to use force in defense of another person to the same degree that the other person would be privileged to use force in their own defense. Here, clearly, the cashier would have been privileged to use deadly defensive force against a reasonably perceived imminent deadly force threat. So a third party observing this robbery would be similarly justified in using deadly defensive force on the cashier's behalf. Alternatively, in many jurisdictions, there's another justification available, the prevention of a forcible felony. And that's technically independent of the defense of others analysis. Generally, of course, the felony in question is one that involves an imminent threat of deadly force harm to an innocent person. So the results of the analysis tends to be the same, but technically it's an alternative legal justification. So these shots fired at the robber through the drive-through window and through that poor cup of water were likely justified on either of those grounds, either defense of others or prevention of a forcible felony. Despite it being likely justified, however, it's worth noting that the car didn't hang around. The car promptly took off. Here's video of that car leaving the scene from an exterior surveillance camera. They left without their food, without anything, and they were never heard from again. So, what's the deal with that? What are the legal consequences of fleeing the scene like this? Does it make the otherwise lawful firing of the shots through the drive-through window suddenly unlawful? And the answer is no. If the shots were lawful, they're lawful. But that flight can be used as the basis to argue consciousness of guilt, a suggestion that the person is fleeing because they are aware they did something wrong and they're attempting to avoid accountability. Now, to the extent that a claim of justification, self-defense, defense of others, prevention of a felony, to the extent that claim is heavily dependent on the credibility of the person claiming the justification, if they flee, that consciousness of guilt flight can severely undermine that credibility and therefore undermine that justification. Here, in this particular case, however, there's objective evidence of the justification, the surveillance video we watched. Objective evidence of justification independent of the shooter's credibility. So this may not likely be an issue, this consciousness of guilt because of flight issue in this particular case. Of course, it's worth noting that there are many reasons why the shooter might have fled that have nothing to do with whether or not the firing in the shots was legally justified. Perhaps they have an outstanding warrant on some unrelated matter, so they don't want contact with law enforcement. And this occurred in California, one of the more severe gun control fascist states. So perhaps their possession of the gun they used here is technically unlawful. And again, they would want to avoid contact with law enforcement if that were the case. And unfortunately, these days, maybe the person who fired the shots is perfectly law-abiding, has no warrants, never been involved in any criminal activity, whatever, maybe they're even in perfectly lawful possession of their pistol. And maybe they even know, maybe they've read the law of self-defense. And they know with certainty that their use of deadly defensive force in defense of others here was technically lawful. Might they still be incentivized to flee? Maybe they're aware that it's quite possible for someone to act in defense of others with the best of intentions and entirely in good faith, and well within the legal boundaries for use of force, and nevertheless have the criminal justice system seek to destroy them and lock them in a cage for much of the rest of their lives. If so, it's not hard to understand why this car might want to disappear off the radar screen, no matter how lawful their conduct may be believed to be and may actually be. All right, I promised you, if you stay to the end, that we would share with you how to access a free copy of our best-selling book, The Law of Self-Defense. Check it out on Amazon. It's 5-star rated, bestseller in its class. This handbook to making yourself hard to convict if you're ever compelled to use force in defense of yourself, your family, or your property. But don't buy it on Amazon. They'll charge you for the book $20 or $25 plus shipping and handling. We only ask you to cover the cost of shipping the book to you. You can get this book for free. Just cover the shipping and handling at lawofselfdefense.com/free book. That's lawofselfdefense.com/free book. And with that said, I'll just remind all of you that if you carry a gun, so you're hard to kill, if you carry a knife, carry pepper spray, study jujitsu, I do all those things. So I'm hard to kill, so my family is hard to kill. If you do any or all of that for those reasons, well, then you also owe it to yourself and your family to make sure you know the law, so you're hard to convict as well. Until next time, I remain Attorney Andrew Branca for the Law of Self-Defense. Stay safe.